Which cancelled TV show deserved another season? Mindhunter. Firefly deserved another season. Better Off Ted. The show was a brilliant satire of corporate business that was far too funny. Amazing cast, incredibly quotable, ended far too soon. Punisher should have had a season 2 with more gang, mafia shenanigans. Altered Carbon should have been able to wrap up its story. Rubicon. Didn't have to be a continuation, but I would love to see more like it. Edit. I have been corrected. Punisher had a season 2. My mistake. Pushing Daisies. Freaks and Geeks. One season was not enough. Probably anything cancelled by Netflix. I'm still salty about Santa Clarita Diet being cancelled. I need to see what's next for Joel. This may seem a bit childish, but Teen Titans. The original one from 2003. Rome. Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency. Dead Like Me. Loved the humor and the concept. I am not okay with this. Inside Job, they got robbed by Netflix. The Expanse. Venture Bros. Dark Matter, what happened after that cliffhanger? The Owl House wasn't outright cancelled, but was shortened from a full 20-episode season 3 to 3 specials. Since the specials are still good, albeit trushed, it makes me want to see what they could have done with the full season. Glow. My Name is Earl. Jericho. Still waiting for the Community movie. 1899. The OA Edit, thank you for all the awards. I would like to donate them to Netflix on behalf of all of us, so they can be melted down and used to pay for a third season. Reaper. Absolutely loved that hit. Oh, and Firefly, but everyone says that. The Last Man on Earth. John Constantine. The Punisher, with John Bernthal. Almost Human with Carl Urban, was so good would it go. Ash vs. Evil Dead. Hannibal. Deadwood Carnival The 9 Rome. Don't Trust the Bee, in Apartment 23. Limitless. The show was edited so AMN well. The Dark Crystal Sires. Happy Endings. It was such a funny show and was hoping they let it continue for a few more seasons. The Society is one I still wish there would be more of. They cancelled it on a cliffhanger. Farscape. But at least we got the miniseries to finish the story. Stargate Universe. You wake up, it's January 1st, 1999, what do you do first? Am I in my 1999 body and life or in my 2023 body? With my current knowledge? Try not to freak out my parents by talking like I'm 32 years old. Exploit any and all knowledge of the future for financial gain. Enjoy the UCK out of the pre-9/11 world for the next year and a half. Edit. Sorry, little over 2.5 years. Woohoo. Party like it's 1999? Start selling Y2K survival kits. Find my mom. Hug her and never let go. Call my dad, tell him I love him and get him to goon a 2-week father and son trip together one last time. He passed away January 18, 99. I was 17. Am I me as I am now transported to 1999 or me as I was back then but with today's knowledge? Because if it's the latter, I get up and start making the tough decision on whether I want to play with my Easy Bake Oven or my PlayStation first. Then you'll consider if an 8-year-old can realistically find a way to avert 9/11. I'm going to hold my 2-year-old who died at the age of 18. Invest in Google, then buy Bitcoin in a few years. Edit. Also Apple, Amazon, Facebook, etc. Go to court to testify that a young me should not return to my parents' custody. Realize how addicted I am to my smartphone. What's the scariest experience you've ever been through? Getting a phone call at work to tell me that my wife's routine surgery had gone wrong due to an anesthetist's mistake and she was now in a coma in the ICU. I dropped everything and ran. What greeted me when I walked in was the stuff of nightmares. Tubes everywhere, machines beeping. My wife was in ICU for 23 days before they took her off life support and she died in my arms. Life has never been the same since. At about 10 years old, I fell through ice on Append. When I came back up, I smacked into ice, instead of the hole I fell through. The water was too murky to see any light from the hole, and I thought that I was witnessing the end of my short life. I was lucky to find the opening again, but as I tried to get back up, the ice kept breaking and I'd go under again. The whole event probably lasted 30 seconds, but to me, it was a lifetime. It's been 35 years, and I'm still nervous on a frozen body of water, even if cars and trucks are driving on it. One night I was working in a rural old wooden gas station. A masked man kicked the door open and robbed me with a shotgun. He was more scared than I was, which made me more scared than he was. I got them out of there with the money and all the cigarettes. The next day the newspaper published my name and address. Tick-borne encephalitis. I didn't even know a tick had bitten me and went from headache to shivers and extreme fever until I wasn't able to walk without my wife supporting me. Even reading made my head spin like crazy and I didn't know what the reason was. Watching my 3-year-old son wither away due to leukemia to the point he was so weak he couldn't walk, sit up, talk, and we would have to hold his head in place so that he could watch Paw Patrol. He's now almost 4 and back to walking again, and seems to be winning this long hard battle. 5 years ago we thought my father had been kidnapped for ransom. Those 3 to 4 days when we thought he was being held somewhere were absolute and sheer terror. Turns out he was killed on day 1. My son's brain surgery. He has epilepsy and had a small portion removed in 2020 to alleviate his seizures and give him a better quality of life. Has spent a week with wires in his brain tracking his seizures as he had them in real time. They slowly stopped his anti-seizure meds to induce them. He had 26 in one night as he slept. Once it was enough. Data. They removed a portion of his brain near his speech and memory center. This was the location of his misfires. The general consensus was that he had a good chance of losing his speech and memory. His personality could disappear. After his surgery, as he was being taken back to his room, he raised his arm to touch his face. The physician told him not to and my son said, "I'm not. I just want to touch it." He spoke before he was fully out of anesthesia. 3 days later he was home. 3 days after that he was being transported back for emergency surgery because of a nasty infection under his skull. The surgeon later said he was maybe 12 hours from dying if he hadn't been seen. He had no symptoms other than a gauze strip. No pain, no fever, nothing. Another brain surgery in 6 weeks with a drain tube and monitor on him at home with nurse visits weekly. He is now seizure-free and on a much lower dose of meds than he was previously. 1,500 daily down to 100 milligrams. I spent a month in the children's center helplessly watching my son slip in and out of consciousness and have hundreds of seizures. The possibility of him waking up with no memories and no way to speak was horrifying to me as his father. So the scariest moment in my life, and keep in mind I've been shot, stabbed, and beaten, was almost losing my 16-year-old child 3 times in 1 month. Back in the early 2000s I lived in northern Minnesota. I was born and raised in Louisiana, so direct opposite side of the US, where the only ice on the roads was when someone dumped out a cooler into the street. At the time I was dating a Canadian girl and went to spend Christmas with her and her family. Drove across the border, went to Ontario, had a good time. I came back across the border a few days after Christmas, sometime late afternoon. It was a 5-ish hour drive from her house to mine. Being the middle of winter, the sun went down very early, so it was dark by the time I got to the first town in Minnesota. I drove down Highway 61, which runs along Lake Superior, and is dotted with blink and miss towns. No one travels that highway that late unless they live there or are a trucker usually driving from Duluth to Thunder Bay. The roads were clear, no snow, no ice that I could see, so I cruised along at my usual 60 miles per hour. I hit a curve that had a patch of black ice and sailed off the road. One side of the road was an almost 90-degree drop straight into Lake Superior. The other was into a forest. I sailed into the forest, barrel rolled a few times, and landed on my wheels in a ravine. I credit my seatbelt for saving my life, so I'm now a hard ass about that when anyone gets into my car. So there were a few problems. First, cell phones weren't nearly as ubiquitous as they are now, and BY extension cell towers weren't covering as much area. I had a cheap prepaid cell phone but no signal. Second, I was in a ravine, so I was hard to see on a road that was hardly traveled anyway. Third, it was the middle of winter and I think in the single digits, somewhere between 0 and 10 FE. Had a blanket I kept in my car in case hit the fan like that, but that won't do good for long since I had to stand on side of the road to be seen, and hope no one else skidded on the ice and squashed me. I for certain thought I was going to freeze to death. A local guy named John, who lived in the town of Schroeder, found me. He brought me to the hospital, I think up in Grand Marais, and even let me stay with him for a few days until someone could come get me. He had a long-distance calling card, remember those, that I used to call my roommate's sand girlfriend to let them know I was alive. I spent the first day sleeping from the painkillers, nothing broken but everything hurt. The second day one of my closest friends said she would come up from Duluth the following day to get me. I slept a lot that day too, and I found out John had this massive collection of musical instruments and played blues. That's what we bonded over, that Ondeem literally saving my life. I found out recently he passed away a few years ago, though I'm not sure where his grave is, but I've been trying to find out just so I can pay my respects. Kinda a humorous one. A few years ago, in the dead of night, my husband and I were woken up by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering at around 3 a.m. Naturally, we assumed that someone was breaking into our house. Our hearts were in our mouths. But we weren't going to split up, so we went downstairs together to check it out. I have never been so scared as when we had to go through our house, room by room, to make sure there wasn't an intruder. But here wasn't, and none of the windows were broken. We were super confused, until we walked into the bathroom. Turns out, tempered glass shower doors have a reputation for randomly exploding. If a crack forms, it very slowly spreads across the rest of the glass, and when it crosses a certain threshold, the whole thing shatters. Ours just happened to be at 3 a.m. I was in a hospital for months because of something else, couldn't get up and had already lost a ton of weight, which made me severely underweight. Thank God, some kind of virus. The doctors couldn't figure out what it was, and got weaker every day. I couldn't eat or drink and vomited all the time. At some point what I spat out was entirely black. Probably dried blood. I can hardly remember that time of my life, but looking in the mirror and seeing my bloodshot eyes where all the veins popped and my chin and neck with burns from the acidity in stomach fluid and my skinny arms and ribs was horrifying. I think I was around 14 at the time and was sure I'd die. It went on for days and then just stopped. We thought it was that hospital virus that happens sometimes, but apparently it wasn't. Still don't know what happened and how I survived. I was chased through the woods by a stranger with a bat. He seemed hell-bent on beating my brains in. I jumped in a river, held my breath and sunk to the bottom. I let the current of the river take me as far as I could until I needed another breath of air. When I came up I couldn't see him anymore, crossed the river and hid in the woods until it got dark and hiked home. My mother woke me up in the middle of the night, told me she had been robbed and stabbed. I had to stay with her while paramedics arrived, helped her clean her wound, and put pressure on it. After she was taken to the hospital, the cops told me it was most likely self-inflicted. I will never forget the feeling I had when she told me, and the sight of it. I will also never forget the feeling of being told my mother was suicidal to the point of stabbing herself. One of the most terrifying, troubling nights of my life, and unfortunately I have more stories that are wildly similar to that. Edit. I was 14. Waking up at the bottom of a cliff with blood everywhere and my hand not fitting between the bones in my arm. I was 13 years old and my dad had just picked me up from high school but had my grandma in the car too, so I sat in the back seat. We were driving back home and my grandma wanted to quickly run into a shop, so we parked up outside the shop. My gran was having trouble getting up the steps out front of the shop, so my dad jumped out to help her. At that exact moment I noticed my dad's gold chain he lost a couple of weeks ago under the seat in front of Meso, ducked down and reached under to get it. As I'm trying to reach under the seat, someone got in the car. I looked up and they kinda looked like my dad from behind, so I said, "Dad?" They turned around and I immediately saw it wasn't my dad. They clearly didn't realize anyone else was in the car and were a little startled but quickly replied, "Sit back and shut up, I'll let you out in a minute." The key was still in the ignition and they started the car and peeled off. I have never really felt fear like it. All the worst kinds of thoughts rushed through my head. Andy was convinced they had stolen the car because I was in it, but they drove down a couple of streets and pulled over and just said, "Okay, get out." I ran back to the shop and halfway ran straight into the arms of my dad, who had been running after the car. I could literally feel the relief that he was feeling through that hug. I survived a chainsaw accident to the throat, 16th March 2022. Trachea, thyroid and epiglottis, hope I spelt those right, were each in 2 parts. The operating doc came by 2 days afterwards, with huge eyes, and told me about the puzzle pieces I had to put back together. I'm basically fully recovered except for my voice that sounds a bit hoarse because of nerve damage. It is slowly recovering and I am going for speech therapy. At the beginning though I did sound a bit like Lemmy Kilmister and thought about reviving Motorhead's Sign of the Horns light skin tone. Being in the middle of a shootout, in the crossfire I was laying on the ground. Okay, so this isn't as bad as some others, but here goes. When I was 7 years old, I got a Furby for Christmas. At the time I was ecstatic as I really wanted one. Now Furbies have their own language. which, one of the words they said sounded suspiciously like my name. My Furby couldn't be turned off save for taking out the batteries, which required a tiny screwdriver that we either didn't have or 7-year-old me couldn't find. Furbies tend to talk whenever they feel like. So I shoved my Furby in my closet and the batteries started to die. With the diminishing battery life, the Furby started to have a less than friendly sound. One night, at around 3 a.m. I wake up to the demonic sound of my low battery Furby saying MYUCKING name. Terrified 7-year-old me evicted Furby the next morning. When my dad hit my mom, she called me crying at 1 a.m. saying she'd locked herself in the bedroom. I transferred her half of their savings out immediately and went home the next day to move her out. The rage in his eyes terrified me. I kept a gun on me and didn't sleep at my own apartment until the restraining order came in. I still carry the gun. The divorce is still being finalized. I'm terrified he'll hurt her and I won't have done enough to protect her. My wife went past her due date, so her doctor decided to induce the pregnancy. It did not go well. After a dozen hours of no progress, the hospital told us that if we didn't do an emergency section, our son would likely die. The whole thing was a blur. I barely remember going to the operating room. My feet were like lead the whole time. Outwardly I was keeping it together, but inside it was sheer panic. Thankfully we were at a top-notch hospital and the C-section went great. However, when we got to the postpartum room it was pretty clear something was wrong with my son. When babies are born they kind of look like little old prune men and not chunky Stay Puft marshmallows. So you can imagine the concern we had when we see his rib cage outlines every time he gasps for breath while pumping his tiny little chest in and out. We alerted the nurse and she went to the center station to figure out what to do. I overheard her, from inside our room, emphatically telling the doctor on call that he needed to be moved to the NICU ASAP. You know in movies when a character experiences a moment of panic? Time slows down, noise becomes garbled and they just kind of drift? That happened to me. The nurse pulled me out of the room and explained what was going to happen and I am just trying to keep it together as I listen. They informed me that because my wife was still recuperating she would not be able to go up into the NICU yet, so it was just me, at like 3 o'clock in the morning having to endure them putting needles and IVs into this tiny little life we had made. He ended up being fine, just a little extra fluid in his lungs, and we were out in 4 days, which is nothing compared to many of the parents in a NICU. This was and still is the scariest experience of my life. My beloved dog, a dock diver and completely amazing swimmer and practiced athletic retriever, swam off into one of the Great Lakes, the mighty Huron. He had been swimming daily in our more calm inland lakes and was very fit. He made it into the shipping channel and I was petrified. He was chasing a sailboat. Wouldn't come back. No jet ski key at our rental. Little dude swam all the way to Charity Island, in the middle of Lake Huron, about 10 miles. You cannot usually see Charity Island from Point Augres, only the lighthouse. It's a fluke he found it in open water. I suspect he chased a pleasure boat there, as it is a tourist designation. I was devastated. Anyway, he was rescued, tired but happy, and brought back to us by Good Samaritans via his tags and imprinted collar. He was said to have enjoyed his boat ride and slept like a log. He visited all 5 Great Lakes in his lifetime and never swam off again. He lived to be just 5 weeks. Shy 17 years old. His ashes were committed to the sandy tides of the mighty Huron, along with my heart R.I.P. Kirby, my forever pal. I'll see you in the surf once again. At a very secluded cabin. A. Look for fallen tree on left. Now there's a huge boulder. Drive into the bush. You'll reach small clearing in about 3 minutes. Now veer right at the 3 fallen trees. Kinda place. No electricity, no phone service, no people. Just me and my young daughter. Went into town for more supplies. As we drove through the bush and came into a clearing, there were 2 vehicles and 6 men. No way forward, no way back. They didn't wave or smile. 2 of them talked while watching us. One said something to the other men, and they moved their trucks to let us by. About a month later, I was contacted by police wanting a description of the men we'd seen. A body had been found nearby and they suspected it was a drug deal gone wrong. Edit, typo. Surviving a car crash that left me paralyzed. Warning. Creepy stepdad story. Shortly after my creepy stepdad decided to shove his hand down my pants in the middle of the broad sober daylight, I let him know, in a diary entry that he read, that I knew he thought he was seducing me and, long story short, made it clear that if he thought he could get away with that, he'd better be AMN sure he was prepared to get away with murder too. The next 8 months were terrifying because he took it like a rejection and started doing this gaslighting thing where he'd stare at me until I objected and then call me a narcissist for thinking everyone's always paying attention to me. He impersonated me online to my friends to get them to tell him confidential things, and basically I managed the next 8 months with a poker face sitting on a rolling cauldron of anxiety like a lid on a crock pot. Then my mom had a dream where Jesus told her to leave him and we got the UCK out.